Hello world of YouTube and welcome to the listening log update for June of 2025. I have 10 albums that I'll be talking about in this video that I spun over the last month with time codes listed in the description as always to each individual review if you'd like to jump around. Thank you so very much for watching these month to month as I drop them. Give it a like if you're already excited to see what I've got to say, and let's go ahead and dive on in.
I'm going to
Off of the heels of what I thought was a splendorous dive into different territories for Turnsite in Glow On, an album I recently just put on my favorite albums of the decade so far video. It's an album that saw them spreading their hardcore-inspired wings into more melodic directions. There was some synth play and all that, and I think they gelled well with those ideas into a great harmony that I think comes to a head in points on Never Enough, but my sentiment is sort of a similar sentiment to some degree that I've seen shared on the internet, in that it feels like it's a bit too much like Glow On, and the production, in my opinion, I think, is a step below the quality on that. There was a bite to the guitars that I thought hit as hard as the drums do on that record that I just don't think happens, by and large, on some of the big stomping moments that come throughout this album, especially throughout the sort of elongated version of a Turnsite jam that is the back half of the album. The album has its highs after that, too, with the sort of pocket of Dull and Sunshower coming in after that to add more punch to that song's sort of kineticism, while I think Dull feels like the most apropos sentiment I could give to parts of this record. For a band like this to also have production that sets those aggressive parts back a little bit just weighs it down ever so slightly for me. I've heard worse produced in this lane. It's not like a huge knock to them, but for a band who's really gotten heavy or hardcore inspired sounds production-wise down, it was kind of shocking to hear them sort of pulling their punches at points on this, sonically speaking. And that's not to say that, like, they need to be writing hardcore songs all the time, because I do like some of the soft moments that were on Glow On, and that do crop up in parts of this. Like, I think that the second half of Look Out For Me, while I think could have gone even farther, I like what they were trying on there. I think that's an interesting sort of avenue for them to travel into. And the same, I feel like, could be said for I Care, a song that I think has this nice sort of mid-tempo energy that I don't think is the best thing they've done, but I could see them, and I could see what they're doing, and I'd be interested to see them explore that avenue more. The back half of the album, though, is where I think the album gets its most interesting and most inconsistent. You know, while I enjoy where Look For Me sort of takes its sound, Ceiling after that is one of the couple of tracks that I feel like are more just glorified interlude fodder. They're songs that, like, I get why they're there, but I don't think do all that much to serve that purpose. Especially in the case of Ceiling, coming after that dance break into what could have been more of that fleshed out, and just sort of feels like this passing graze in a hallway. You know, one song that I feel like feels like that, but to an even more degree, is Light Design, just because I don't think that song has all that much going on, even if it is trying to lean more into these synth jams. They've done better ones, or done better meldings of synth ideas, at least on Glow On. And even on Birds, I think Birds is a moment later in the track listing where the sort of ambient ideas come to a more aggressive head and sees that meeting of the worlds doing so pretty strongly. I like that pocket of it, and I think Slow Dive is a solid enough jam after that too. There's a lot of highs to this record, and I feel like it's not necessarily gonna go down as my favorite in the band's catalog, but I think it's got potential. And I see what people do see in it that like it more than me, but I just don't think it's comparable to anything they've done. And I've talked about all of their records on this channel at least now at some point. And I mean, hell, I just talked about their debut a couple of months ago. I still love the fuck out of Nonstop Feeling. This album is solid. I could see them really expanding on these ideas and doing some cool stuff with them. And I'm still excited to see what these guys are doing. But I'm giving this a 7. I don't think it's nearly the best thing they've done. It feels like it's less inspired and more recycled in some aspects, and it's got some ideas that I don't think just sound as good or as full as they've sounded in the past. And it's kind of shocking, but like, it's not bad at the end of the day. It's just solid.
Catch him with his nose down and wipe it. This game is a bitch, you gotta practice.
It's no secret, I think, Lil Wayne, as an artist, while deservedly respected for his longevity in the rap game, that longevity has led to a wild inconsistency from a discography standpoint. You know, he's one of those artists that whenever I decide to do that, it'll be an interesting journey through the highs and lows of the mind of Lil Wayne. You know, he's got a lot of albums that I would say are classics, though, at the end of the day. Especially the Carter albums. I don't think he's dropped an album with the Carter attached to it that I think is below a 7 until this point. But, like, even the Carter 5, I thought was very solid, if not filled with a couple of missteps. It had some fun collabs and interesting collabs at the end of the day. But the Carter 6 has the kind of, like, rotoscope reflection on Lil Wayne and hip-hop that I would kind of expect from these albums, but it decides to get reflective on eras in Wayne's career that I don't think are the best parts of Wayne's career, and to see him get nostalgic for that's a little fucking wild. Like, I think it starts strong enough. I think that it's an interesting bridge of himself to hip-hop through the first handful of songs. Like, it's got that strong intro with King Carter and Welcome to the Carter. Bells is a song that you could tell he had a lot of fun making, being homage to Rock the Bells. I think that it's a fun flip. In my opinion, I think this is a solid jam that I think goes into a decent collab with Big Axe the Plug on hip-hop. It sort of sees him bridging himself to the now in hip-hop on, like, a solid beat. You know, I get why the song after it also exists, but I don't like Jelly Roll, and I don't think Big Sean does a whole lot on that song, but, like, I really don't like Jelly Roll, and that, it sucks. And it's a sort of harbinger of some of the other just not great moments to come, but, like, there's worse things on the horizons. And it sort of is the beginning of the wild inconsistencies that lie. Because, like, wedging Banned from No between Sharks and The Days, a collab with Bono that sounds ripped out of 2009, and I don't mean that in a good way. It's giving, like, Insano, the Nitro Mega version by Kid Cudi, but, like, Lil Wayne's version. Wedging Loki's theme between, like, a Weezer cover and a reminder that Rebirth exists is definitely a choice, but, like, not one that I would typically make, but I also don't like Lil Wayne covering Weezer, much less being reminded of Lil Wayne and Weezer. People have dunked on Peanuts to an Elephant, and it's like, it's kind of apt. And that same kind of inconsistency just kind of sends the album off into the sunset. Because, like, I love Being Myself. I think that it's a solid collab with Manny Fresh. I love seeing those two come together. I think that that's a great moment. And with Written History, he sort of just closes the book on that reminiscing that goes on with this. It's, like, bookended nicely. But, like, the book is just an era of Wayne reminiscing that I don't need, by and large. This is not one of my favorite albums of the year. Even its highs, I don't think save it from those lows, because those highs don't even go, like, toe-to-toe with, like, Golden Age Wayne. It's not as bad when it's good as, like, Funeral, another New Era Wayne album that I don't necessarily love. But I don't think it's, like, it's not going much higher than that, even with those highs, because those lows are just garbo. I'm giving this a 4. It's not good, but it's also not, like, horrendous. Deceit from those close to you can really feel like the largest sword is stabbing through your chest, and that feels like the frustrations expressed by Lil Simz throughout her newest album, Lotus, where in certain pockets she really goes through the dissolving of her relationship with her longtime producer, Inflow, who produced her last handful of records that I had gotten into her through. But I think that what's interesting about this is that all of the elegance and, like, nuance in the production that I loved over her last 2 records isn't lost on Lotus. If anything, this feels like a flowering out, a blooming out into various different stylistic pivots that blend well with her brand of really well-constructed bar spinning. Like, you've got this sort of, like, build-up and release throughout Thief and Flood, where it feels like you see the real mission statement of the emotion behind this project evolve, while tracks like Free, Hollow, and Blood have this storytelling woven throughout it that doesn't necessarily feel tied to the core drama that Simz is talking about on here, but it feels like ripples from that drama that show the aftershocks of pain, while having moments like Young to dip away into moments away from that, acting as bits of brevity amidst the sadness. I love the emotional weight that gets explored on this record. And there's a real core of passion throughout this, where it feels like on the other side, all the frustration Simz might have felt during the making process of this album that she talks about on here, feels like it came to a head to another great notch in her belt as an artist. There's a whole laid-back groove to a lot of this that feels like a piece, that more feels like trying to find peace than feeling defeated from the onslaught of tragedy or personal tragedy that one's facing. And I love that even if it doesn't necessarily give you much brevity, even through that emotional weight, you can feel a peace when listening to the album, thanks to the sonic backdrop of this. I really like this album. I don't know if it'll go down as my favorite Simz project, but it's another really strong record from this year, and another strong notch in her discography. I'm still giving this an 8 out of 10, because it's a really well-articulated point of expression for her, in my opinion.
From my child, there's always a brave goodbye, a dripping with a hot.
For a band that's as interested in pushing their own sonic identity as King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, it's amazing to me that it took them this long to go the full orchestration route. But on Phantom Island, we see them taking their sort of jammy, desert-inspired rock ideology and funneling a shit ton of orchestration on top of it all, with a cleanness that I think really opens their bare bones sound up in a way that gives it life. You know, while a lot of their sounds are very dry and sound like they are ripped straight out of the Australian sun, the fact that these songs are scraps from their last album makes it feel all the more crazy how well an orchestra fits over this. You wouldn't know that this is necessarily an offshoot from the boogie stuff, considering they do dip away from that in pockets of this, but like, it pairs well with the boogie-inspired rock that was still the focus of that last album. You know, they wash in grandeur in Phantom Island, but it doesn't take long throughout Dead Stick and Lonely Cosmos, where you just hear them locking in the pocket, and the rest of the musicians around them just following suit masterfully. By the time Panpsych comes into the track listing, it almost feels like this band, this orchestra, has been a part of this unit the entire time. While it honestly feels like there are more evolving parts of the sound that I'm not all that familiar with, the parts here that are intrinsically the group aren't lost in all of the tapestry, so to speak. There are still moments of grooves, like I've talked about, but the moments of whimsy that are added on top of that, like throughout parts of Panpsych or Aerodynamic, have this sound that doesn't feel too unfamiliar to the group. It doesn't feel like them really trying on a new pair of pants, and more just hemming it up a bit to make it fit a little better with their ideas. And I love that about it. Even the shit like Silent Spirit and Sea of Doubt, which more see them sort of like adorning more of that boogie sound than the more desert-influenced stuff, still just fills out the genre pool so nicely. I'm going to be giving this an 8 out of 10. I think it's a really cool idea. I think it's a good repurposing of one's scraps. And it feels like an interesting sort of like arrival from the flight, so to speak. Really cool ideas, and just another great selection in a kaleidoscope discography of interesting ideas.
Why you gotta be first place all the time?
I don't know if there's a universe where I could have ever predicted the Tings coming back, first of all, considering where they left the industry and the mood in which they left the industry, but that they would also come back with a Fleetwood Mac-ass rebranding that sees them stripping away from the, like, dance pop roots that they burgeoned out with and just go hard into more arranged compositions and a, like, rootsiness that, like, the record that they gave us with Home is the sort of, like, inconsistent first steps one could assume would happen with that hard of a stylistic pivot. There's components of this across the board, technically speaking, are pretty nice and fit the, like, the mood of the songs that they're in, like the opener Good People Do Bad Things, or the melding of, like, a sax solo with a guitar solo on Home. Two songs that I would say don't rank amongst my favorites in the track listing, but they've at least got components that still excite me or entice me, so to speak. There are other songs that I think holistically are better constructed, even if they don't have quite the flashiness coded throughout them. Like one of the catchy songs on here, "Dreaming," or the like mid-tempo album-ass cut winning. I even like the juxtaposition of like the sort of intense ideas juxtaposed with the softness on Danced on the Wire, which leads me to one of my other real outlying inconsistencies and complaints and critiques with this record, is that while I think Katie White sounds pretty solid on a lot of this, even if I think that clean production creates an isolation for her, from her to the rest of the instrumentation that I don't think fits this sonic palette, she at least sounds great. And she provides some great harmonies for Jules DeMartino, who I would argue is the bigger inconsistency of the two. Granted, he may have sung with the older stuff the group did, and I just didn't know about it, but like, his stoicism with the group felt very purposeful, and him sort of stepping out into the light. I can respect the approach, and I think that it helps sell this rebrand. I just don't think he's as good singing-wise as Katie. On top of that, there's just some really mediocre songs that start to crawl into the track listing as this album really starts to wind up. Like Mind Thunder, or In My Hand. By and large, I think that this album is, like, fun enough, but it's not going to be anything that, as a whole, I'm going to be revisiting or having much to write home about at the end of the day. I'm going to be giving this a 6 out of 10. It's not horrible. It's a solid step into a new world, but I think that they could absolutely tighten it up, branch out in other ways, and just do more with this sound to make it more interesting, dynamic, and really just exciting. Because there's a lack of excitement through some of the wistfulness on here that I think makes this album sort of taper off the more that you kind of keep it in your rotation. An artist I've always liked the contributions of in select songs I've heard but haven't heard a full album from is Rico Nasty. So I figured I would change that this year by listening to Lethal and adding it to the listening log update for this month. One of the things I wasn't wholly expecting, even if I've seen her do a menagerie of styles under this umbrella of like trap-inspired music, was her finding a way to like create a harmony of those excursions across a record. Like it goes a bit like an echelon higher than like some of her contemporaries that she's worked with. There's parts of this, especially the pop-driven stuff, that feels very like in the same spirit. Teeth Sucker is some like hype 2006 rock shit that I think blends really solidly with some of like the pop trap ideas on that song. And Smoke Break is like a pop-punk jam that I absolutely loved seeing her tap into on here. And honestly, walking away from this project, I almost wish there was more of that kind of attitude. Because, like, yeah, I think she does the, like, sensual stuff well, too. And I think that some of that does blend well with some of these, like, aggressive and, like, hard-hitting tendencies. Like, songs like On the Low and Say We Did with their, like, chiptune-inspired production, I would say also sort of tip the scales in the other way for being more interesting than some of her contemporaries. And I think lend for just as satisfying of, like, these small songs that are to the point and catchy but lend to the mood of, like, this almost relationship through toxicity that feels like the point of parts of this. I like the plays with extremes on here, and I like that she really ties together those extremes with a lot of solid jams. I will say the one drawback to that sort of approach is that you do have these moments that even on a short record, which almost seems more damning, the album feels like it's sort of spinning in circles in a way that, like, makes some of those meddling points between the extremes feel all the more monotonous. But, like, those points I would say are few and far between. This is a very solid album that I think showcases Rico's artistry in a more full portrait than I was expecting it to be, and I'm walking away happy, or at least enjoying components of it. I think that there's some really choice moments throughout that show some interesting artistic avenues that Rico's exploring that I would highly recommend somebody, you know, tap more into on like a larger scale, because she should be able to run, you know, a gamut with this type of genre blending that I think could be more successful for her, and I would love to see that for her. I'm giving this a 6. It's really solid. I'd love to see a further nourishing to some of those moments where the record sort of gets like it's spinning in circles. It's incredibly solid. I feel like if you enjoy artists doing multi-genre experiments, this is an interesting insight into parts of that happening in a more popular adjacent realm. I'm officially a Louie Zong follower, it would seem, because I'm covering another artist from the pocket funk pariah that I've been slowly getting more into over the last handful of months. He's dropped a new album, Big Stepper, another sort of pocket project living in the world of an idea, something that he seemingly makes his calling card. This time around, this, like, titular named identity of the Big Stepper being the focus of his funk ideas this time around. And the sonic palette of this is one of swankiness, but it's got a cleanness to it that sort of feels tangential to some of the realms that I've explored from his in recent months. And I honestly think it's a really nice step adjacent and above some of those sonic realms I've heard him dabble in the past. There's a fullness across tracks like Big Stepper and the twinkliness of Mysterious Swagger that enhance the moods of their given track in a way that I think is pretty fucking choice. It's also because I think part of this just shares a similar sonic palette to a game like Bomb or Cyberfunk, so I think that like the clean funk on here also just sounds really fucking nice. It's very Hideki Naganuma inspired in some degrees, it sounds like, and I'm never going to have a problem with that. Like the synth tones on their Yellow Arcana Ensemble or the beat approach of It's a Racing Game Charlie Brown sort of also lend to that feeling in a way that I think is pretty nice. But even then, like tracks like Nervous Dancer and The Doghouse sort of just feel in the wheelhouse of what I've heard from him over the last couple of releases I've heard. It's funky, but it's got some flair and style that's sort of like indicative of vintage funk in a way that I think is modernized just as nicely. It's a solid-ass little record. It's another little pocket project that's got some choice beats and some good funky vibes that if you've liked his funk excursions in the past, you're not really going to be disappointed with what this has going on. I honestly like it a little more in some regards to some of the stuff I've spun recently. I think this is a 7 out of 10. I think this is another solid little batch of funky jams that like is in and out, but it keeps the vibes in check for when you're with it, and it may incentivize you to want to spin it again just to keep the vibes healthy. I fell off of Fallujah back in 2019 when I was incredibly underwhelmed by Undying Light. For as much as I love Dreamless, it's what got me into them. I just was totally not into the sound of Undying Light. And considering it was an album with a label change, I was like, okay, if this is what they're going to be pillaging forth for, I'm out. But their newest album, Xenotaph, was requested by Rockin' Moves with Tyler. And I was skeptical, but I'd still give it a spin. And honestly, I like this a hell of a lot more than Undying Light. I think that it has points where it kind of dips into pockets I don't wholly love, but they are brief moments surrounded by some pretty solid technical metal. I think that the pivot like farther away from some of the like the overt gent inspired roots was a pretty solid idea, and I think that like landing in the more just like showcasing of your love of noodling with some fun riff work around that is an amicable pivot in my opinion. The album sort of flourishing out from In Stars We Drowned welcomes the album and the style pretty decently enough. I don't necessarily think that like the intro is my favorite part of the album. A lot of the melodic driven stuff is the most inconsistent part of the album for me. Like I don't think that it works that well on In Stars We Drown or on Kaleidoscopic Waves. I think it adds a good accent to the sort of moment of intensity that it comes in on Kaleidoscopic Waves. But, like, I think it's better used on, like, the Crystalline Veil. I think that that's a really solid use of, like, melding a lot of vocal melody with your stuff. And, the ambient focus and the backdrop and the production of, like, the deep synths, I think is done pretty well, honestly. I normally go back and forth with a more cleaner approach, but I think that, like, the guitar sound on here has a nice bite to it and some room to breathe, especially on some of the solos, like on Kaleidoscopic Waves. Like, I don't know. This album, I'm much more into what they got going on. The moments where they do get proggy is still nice, if not a bit too infrequent. I would rather moments like that than some of the moments like A Parasitic Dream, which are solid, don't get me wrong, but that's a track that left me wanting more. It felt more like a glorified interlude, and on a record that doesn't necessarily like sit too long, it's kind of weird to have songs like that, where like, it's heavy. It's got some cool production ideas. I dig the world that they're kind of dancing in on that song, but it is a song that still just left me wanting at least more. But yeah, this is a solid bounce back. Thanks for the request. I dug this a decent amount. I don't know how much continued mileage I'll get out of the whole experience, but there are some songs that I really fuck with heavy on here. I think that like Kaleidoscopic Waves is pretty choice, and again, and like the final song is this big gargantuan closer that I think does send the album off really strongly. This album, pretty choice. If you want some good technical death metal, there's some pretty solid stuff here. Just like their last album, Musical Tangent, Shake sent me Psynwav's newest album, Musical Transients, via Asai's fucking Guitar Hero video, and it was a fucking hell of a watch, but, you know, listening to the album on its own is its own fun experience, because these mashups are, like their last album, layered and really just expertly blended. I loved Musical Tangents. It was one of my favorite albums of the year that year, so, like, I was stoked when this was just a thing, but, like, seeing that it is this sort of real deeper expression with them really going through self-discovery is an incredible another layer to that cake that I love. It's about liberation, self-liberation, and it is, like, a very interesting cobbling of songs, but like it's meant to service that concept. Like, it has this excellent rug pull after the first song, which has the kind of flavors and like has like some songs from Musical Tangents being reintroduced, and it's interesting sort of like welcome back to, but like it has a really swift pivot into that conflict already in place with I Want to Be a Rock, a fucking awesome harsh transitioning between songs, but like making it work. But like also keeping in mind the spirit of mashups and all that with song choice, and not just with like Nickelback on I Wanna Be a Rock, but like the flipping of Live and Learn into Live Laugh Love with the sonic memery is just potent on that song, and I love it. It's also a great point for Basket Case to come back into the album's sort of cycle, because it feels almost like a theme at this point. And like that memery goes on through Shrimp Shripping, which is another fucking banger. I love the melding of Cara Cara Bonito and Kendrick Lamar. It goes deeper than that after that in ways that I fucking love. Like throughout Facts and Lodging, which just feels like the assault of information to your senses reaches a good emotional peak throughout the memery of Have Had It With This Name and the finale. I don't know. This is a beautiful mashup record. I think that it's a record that has lovely layers. It's one of those albums that makes me happy to see that like mashup culture is still evolving, and like just artists are finding ways to use the genre in really interesting fashions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm giving this a 9 out of 10. I think this is a wonderful record. I think that it is equal parts hilarious and sincere. I think that it feels like a very personally driven mashup album, which is cool. And shout outs to Psynwav. And that was what I spun throughout June. Do you like my thoughts on what I spun? Do you have differing opinions? Is there something you'd like for me to spin that I haven't talked about yet this year? Leave all those thoughts in the comments down below, along with making sure that you give it a like and subscribe if you haven't yet already. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week, depending on what I've got going on. Barring I can overcome this hurdle I'm facing in it, F-Zero Part 2 will finally come out this weekend. That game is hard as shit. Thank you so very much for watching, though. I've been Viral Wreck. You guys will get his lives and situations, and I'll see you another day.